There are years, and then there is 1968. In the span of 12 months, the United States watched a foreign war shatter its own government's optimistic narrative, watched two of its most compelling political voices brought down within 2 months of each other, watched its own law enforcement battle demonstrators in the streets of Chicago on live national television, and then, in its final days, watched 3 men read from the Book of Genesis while orbiting the moon, describing the Earth itself as a fragile, blue marvel suspended in darkness. This is an analysis of 1968, a year that historians still return to, again and again, as a kind of hinge point in American life, when the confidence of the post-war era finally, visibly, cracked open, and something considerably more uncertain and more contested took its place. To understand 1968, you have to walk through it roughly as Americans themselves experienced it that year, one gathering crisis after another, arriving with almost no time to recover between them. The year's first great rupture began not in the United States, but in South Vietnam, in the early morning hours of January 31st, 1968, as Vietnamese families across the country prepared to celebrate Tet, the Lunar New Year, a holiday traditionally accompanied by an informal ceasefire in the ongoing conflict. That ceasefire was the cover for what North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces had actually been planning for months. A massive, coordinated series of strikes touching more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously, including an assault on the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon itself, and a prolonged, intense battle for control of the historic city of Hue. For the American public, watching much of this unfold on television in their own living rooms, the shock wasn't merely the scale of the operations. It was the gap between what they were now seeing with their own eyes and what their own government had spent the better part of the previous year telling them. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, had assured the public in late 1967 that there was, in his own words, light at the end of the tunnel. Tet made that assurance appear to a rapidly growing number of Americans, either badly mistaken or deliberately misleading. Militarily, it's worth being precise about what Tet actually was and wasn't. American and South Vietnamese forces, reinforced by smaller contingents from South Korea, Australia, and other allies, ultimately inflicted immense tactical losses on the attacking North Vietnamese and Viet Cong units, and within weeks had recaptured virtually every position the offensive had temporarily seized. By the narrow measure of territory held and operational losses inflicted, Tet was a clear tactical defeat for its planners. But the offensive's true target had never really been a specific hilltop or city block. It was American public confidence itself, and on that front, Tet succeeded beyond what even its own strategists likely anticipated. On February 27, 1968, the respected CBS news anchor Walter Cronkite, having just returned from his own reporting trip to the Vietnamese battlefields, delivered a rare personal editorial to his television audience, concluding that the conflict appeared destined to end in what he termed a stalemate, and that the only realistic path forward for the United States was to negotiate an honorable exit rather than continue pursuing an increasingly elusive victory. Whatever the precise, disputed details of President Lyndon Johnson's private reaction to that broadcast, the broader political effect was undeniable. Public support for Johnson's handling of the conflict and for his presidency more broadly went into a steep and continuing decline. In March, anti-war Senator Eugene McCarthy came startlingly close to defeating a sitting president in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. And on March 31, 1968, facing a mounting revolt within his own party, Lyndon Johnson went on television to announce new restrictions on the bombing of North Vietnam, and, in a stunning coda that few Americans had expected, that he would not seek re-election to a second full term. The country had barely absorbed that political earthquake when just 4 days later, an entirely different kind of tragedy struck. On April 4, 1968, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was in Memphis, Tennessee, supporting a strike by the city's black sanitation workers, a cause he viewed as directly connected to his broader, increasingly urgent focus on economic justice alongside civil rights. That evening, standing on the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel as he prepared to leave for dinner, King was struck by a single rifle shot and fatally wounded. He was pronounced dead within the hour. The gunman, an escaped convict named James Earl Ray, fled the scene, sparking a global manhunt that would ultimately track him down at London's Heathrow Airport more than 2 months later. Ray would eventually plead guilty to the shooting and receive a 99-year sentence, though questions about whether he acted entirely alone would continue to surface in subsequent decades, without ever producing conclusive evidence of a broader plot. The immediate aftermath of King's passing revealed, with painful clarity, just how much unresolved anger and grief existed within black communities across the country. Anger that had been building for years against the slow pace of genuine racial and economic progress, even as King himself had continued to preach a philosophy of nonviolent resistance. Severe unrest erupted in more than 100 American cities in the days that followed, requiring National Guard deployment in cities including Memphis and Washington, D.C. itself. On April 9th, King was laid to rest in his hometown of Atlanta, his casket carried through the city's streets in a simple wooden farm cart drawn by 2 mules, a deliberately humble image that stood in stark contrast to the scale of national and international mourning surrounding his passing. In the wake of the event, Congress moved with unusual speed to pass the Fair Housing Act, generally regarded as the last major legislative achievement of the entire civil rights era, a bittersweet legacy secured, in significant part, by the shock and grief that followed King's loss. If this kind of careful, well-sourced walk through one of the most consequential years in American history is valuable to you, subscribing genuinely helps us continue producing detailed work like this. The nation had barely 2 months to process King's passing before a second political tragedy struck, this time aimed directly at the heart of the Democratic Party's presidential race. Robert F. Kennedy, the younger brother of President John F. Kennedy and a sitting United States Senator, had entered the 1968 presidential race as an increasingly compelling, anti-war, pro-civil rights candidate, drawing genuine, broad-based enthusiasm from voters who saw him as perhaps the only figure in American politics capable of bridging the country's deepening divisions. On the night of June 4, 1968, Kennedy won a crucial victory in the California Democratic primary, and shortly after midnight, addressed a jubilant crowd of supporters gathered in the Ambassador Hotel's ballroom in Los Angeles, closing his remarks with an optimistic call to carry the campaign onward to Chicago. Leaving the stage, Kennedy was guided through a shortcut route through the hotel's kitchen pantry, where he paused to shake hands with kitchen staff. It was there that a 24-year-old assailant named Sirhan, standing just a foot away, fired several shots from a small revolver. Kennedy was struck multiple times, including a fatal entry to the head, and collapsed to the floor, where a hotel busboy famously knelt beside him, pressing a rosary into his hand. He passed away at a Los Angeles hospital nearly 26 hours later, at the age of 42. Sirhan, a Palestinian immigrant, would later testify that his motive stemmed from deep opposition to Kennedy's support for Israel following the 1967 Arab-Israeli conflict, a diary found among his possessions containing explicit statements of his intent to target the senator. He was convicted and initially sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life imprisonment after California's Supreme Court struck down the state's capital punishment statute in 1972. Kennedy's loss, arriving less than 5 years after his own brother's assassination, and barely 2 months after King's passing, deepened an already profound sense of national trauma and instability. With Kennedy gone, and with President Johnson having already withdrawn from the race, the path toward the Democratic presidential nomination fell to Vice President Hubert Humphrey, a candidate who had not competed in a single primary election that year, a fact that would fuel considerable anger among the party's increasingly restless, anti-war grassroots activists as the party gathered for its national convention in Chicago that August. That convention would produce the year's third great public rupture, one played out almost entirely in front of television cameras. Thousands of anti-war demonstrators, alongside civil rights activists and a range of other left-leaning groups, descended on Chicago in late August, intent on protesting both the ongoing conflict in Vietnam and what they viewed as the Democratic Party establishment's refusal to meaningfully change course. Chicago's powerful mayor, Richard J. Daley, determined that no such disruption would be permitted to unfold in his city, deployed a substantial force of Chicago police officers, backed by National Guard troops and Secret Service personnel, to maintain strict control over the demonstrators. On the night of August 28, 1968, outside the Conrad Hilton Hotel, where many convention delegates were staying, that control effort collapsed into open, chaotic street confrontation. Police officers moved against the assembled crowd with batons and tear gas, and protesters, along with a number of reporters and even some convention delegates caught in the chaos, were struck and gassed in scenes broadcast live on national television. As police transport vehicles filled with detained demonstrators, tear gas canisters were reportedly tossed inside before the doors were closed, and the crowd outside began chanting a phrase that would become one of the enduring images of the entire decade. "The whole world is watching." A subsequent government commission investigating the events concluded that the actions that night constituted what it explicitly termed a law enforcement riot, finding that authorities had used considerably excessive force against the demonstrators. Hubert Humphrey secured the Democratic nomination inside the convention hall that same week, but the images broadcast from the streets outside had already done lasting political damage, contributing significantly to the party's ultimate defeat that November at the hands of Republican nominee Richard Nixon. After a year defined so overwhelmingly by fracture, civil unrest, and public disillusionment, 1968 closed with a moment that stood in almost jarring contrast to everything that had preceded it. In December, NASA launched Apollo 8, a mission that would carry astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and William Anders farther from Earth than any human beings in history, and, for the first time, into actual orbit around another celestial body entirely. On Christmas Eve, December 24, 1968, as the spacecraft circled the moon, the three astronauts conducted a live television broadcast watched by an audience estimated at hundreds of millions of people around the world. During that broadcast, taking turns reading aloud from the opening verses of the Book of Genesis, the astronauts described, in words thousands of years old, the creation of the heavens and the earth, their voices transmitted across roughly 250,000 miles of empty space to a planet that had spent the preceding 12 months tearing itself apart. It was during this same mission that astronaut William Anders captured what would become one of the most enduring photographs in human history, an image now known simply as Earthrise, showing the Earth itself, small, blue, and strikingly fragile, rising above the gray, cratered horizon of the moon. Jim Lovell, reflecting on the view from lunar orbit during that same broadcast, remarked on the vast loneliness of the scene before them, and how it underscored, with startling clarity, exactly what awaited them back on the world they had temporarily left behind. It's difficult to overstate just how deliberately significant the timing of that image felt to the millions of people who saw it in the final days of this particular year. a photograph capturing the entirety of human civilization as a single, borderless, indivisible sphere, arrived at the exact moment that same civilization, or at least its most powerful nation, had spent 12 consecutive months demonstrating, through war, tragic loss, and street confrontation, just how deeply and painfully divided it actually remained. The Earthrise photograph would go on to become closely associated with the environmental movement that gained significant momentum in the years immediately following, credited by numerous historians as a genuine catalyst for a new, planet-wide perspective on humanity's shared and finite home. Whether that particular image could meaningfully heal the specific wounds 1968 had inflicted on American political and civic life is a considerably harder question, one that historians examining this year have continued to debate for more than half a century since. What makes 1968 such an enduringly significant subject of historical analysis isn't simply the sheer density of consequential events packed into a single calendar year, remarkable as that density genuinely was. It's the way these four seemingly separate stories, a foreign conflict's credibility collapsed under its own government's optimistic claims, two towering political figures cut down within 9 weeks of each other, a party's own convention descending into televised street confrontation, and a mission to the moon that offered, however briefly, a genuinely different way of seeing an entire fractured planet, all unfolded within the same narrow, 12-month window, forcing an entire nation to process an almost unbearable accumulation of trauma, disillusionment, and, in that final unexpected Christmas broadcast from lunar orbit, something that briefly, at least, resembled hope. Historians have spent more than 5 decades since debating exactly how much of what followed in American political and cultural life, the deep and often bitter partisan divisions, the lasting public skepticism toward government institutions, the fundamental reshaping of the Democratic Party itself, can be traced directly back to this single, extraordinary, and profoundly difficult year. If this deeper, connected look at how 1968's separate crises actually fit together gave you a fuller picture of this pivotal year, share this video with someone who'd value understanding exactly how much history unfolded within those 12 remarkable months.